Xin Wei is our first keynote speaker. He's a pioneer, artist, philosopher, many different experimentations, and I think immediately when we thought about this theme of the democratic gestures and actions and experimentation in art, I immediately thought about your work, because I think that you have been one of the first ones really putting together the idea of collectiveness, experimentation in art, and let's say digitalization or experimentation with these new media that are not new technologies anymore. So we leave to you, and I hope that we will have some time for questions.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much to Barbara and colleague and friend for some time, and also to the Common Ground Network for making this possible. Okay, so just remember, basically, I'll be talking about many things, but basically, maybe to keep in mind, there's a three-part intention for this, which hopefully will become evident. One is how to collectively come together to make sense of a very complex situation that's beyond any particular frame of reference. A second is to imagine other than what is the case. And the third would be to somehow, how can we prototype or enact some different alternative imaginaries? Okay? The first thing that I'll start with is maybe something hopefully a bit amusing. Basically, serious and amusing, which is to problematize the question of the image. Okay, this is from the program, okay, that you all probably have seen, which says, which I agree with, we're in the moment where we have, thanks to digital technologies, a possibility and in fact the fact of the fusion, of the blending of these different kinds of media that used to be considered separately, digital, audio, digital, gestural, etc. Okay, what are some of the consequences? Okay, I'm just going to take 2 minutes to show you. I'll go back. Okay, to show you. Okay, in 2 minutes. Okay, 2.5 minutes. A composite of 2 different ways of looking at some of the possibilities thanks to generative AI. This is just a start.
What I did was I first created this image in an AI tool. I then uploaded this image as a reference into Blink, and this is the final result. In this case, we use ChatGPT. So for this specific prompt, we're going to head over here to my prompt generators database. Okay? Now this database is going to contain nothing but prompt generators. Prompt engineers that specifically generate prompt. This one is called POV 10X. Okay, so now with the multi prompt pasted in, here it is in ChatGPT. It basically says, please stay on the roll as the open prompt engineer. What this is going to do is going to take the most basic prompt. For example, masterpieces of visual storytelling. So the first thing I said was just POV, hyperspeed, Jurassic World, escapade. This is going to be my first in the ChatGPT. Look what it's going to give me. Right here, here is the 10x version.
So I tell my students that using generative AI and using text prompts to generate images or videos, whatever, which is extremely cumbersome, as you will see from here on the left-hand side. It's like driving a car with sticks and brooms and things in between the driver and the car. Okay, when any painter or any dancer or anybody who makes films for a living, well, already has actually generations of techniques between the body and the word, right? Which are highly refined. Same thing like driving a car, refined over generations. How to make the body and the technical ensemble of the human and the machine work together in various ways, including social structures, right? Highly developed, very, very refined, very complex, but very rich. Okay, so, and also that other thing exists. It's not that the image and the video are independent. Right now, in the current moment, with generative AI and LLMs, they're actually subsumed into the regime of text. Okay, so to commoditize look at what one could do image. This is not right. This is real time. So in this case, every region of the video is a result of an arbitrary chain of computations. So just simply looking at the activity in that region. And I mapped the different regions to different sounds and voices, up to dozens of sounds. So I can map a sound, birds here, ocean here, wind there, and so I move my pencil out. I can basically pull out from the region the camera sees various sounds. I can overshape it by gesture, a texture of sounds. Okay? So this is just an example. So the question is, we can ask, instead of asking what is an image, which I'm sure people will do, was a good image, was a fake image, we could ask, what are the effects? What are the effects of an image? Or even better, what are the effects of imaging, the process of making images? And finally, what are the experiential operators that would have similar effects to the practice of imaging, okay, making imaging? Final preliminary comment about problematizing image. We know from, let's say, 2,500 years of East and the West of interrogation, how writing is detached from actuality, to put it very briefly, okay? With photography, we have 100 years of this conceit that the photograph and the image has some sort of, direct connection with actuality, but that's broken. That's broken with generative AI. Okay, I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion around that kind of question today or in the next 2 days. So after generative AI, photography or the photographed image, I would say, is in the same relation to actuality as text and writing has been to actuality. All right? So this is just a little brief. I'm sure there'll be many more discussions on this. Now I will switch to what I would like to speak about today in my talk. I'm borrowing from Isabel Stenger's book, Making Sense in Common. This question of, well, not just her book, her that book, but over decades of work, okay, this notion of cosmopolitical. I won't go into that today, but I'm really thinking about how we can combine, let's say, ecosystemic ways of thinking along with other ways of thinking about the humane, okay? But in a way that I like to ask is not based on me, like what is important to me, or based on what is important to humans alone. So by that, I would just ask as non-egocentric and non-anthropocentric ways of thinking, okay? Morris Peckham, an American theorist from a few generations ago, wrote a book called Man's Rage for Chaos, in which he's asking, why do people make art? All sorts of ways, in centuries, in different cultures. But what is this practice of art as a behavior? Not the products of art, but the behavior of art making. Okay? He's saying here that, well, before we get to that question, there seems to be this rage for order, we call it rage for order. This need, in fact, a practical need, to make sense of the world around us, experiences, and then to form regular patterns, regular categories, let's say, or schema, or rules, or algorithms, okay? They give us regular determined effects for various hypotheses or inputs. Rage for order, okay? But this kind of, these prior orientations that we bring to a situation, individually or collectively, works because it helps us ignore what we think of as extraneous, the exogenous, that's not relevant to the situation. These orientations help us get along. But this very racial order gives us the illusion of control. This is referring to a work by Sander van der Loo and Gary Dirks, some colleagues I've learned a lot from over the years. They wrote a paper called The Illusion of Control, where it has this loop going on. The more we seem to be, these categories seem effective, the more we will tend to basically filter our experiences of the world through just those categories. And those categories get more and more sharply defined. Okay? So they exclude more and more of that which we consider to be extraneous or noise. Okay? This is part of their other work, the illusion of control. Going back to more second, it says this then puts us into a rut, so that this orientation, which gives more and more sense of power and efficacy, right, will also be will be disqualifying us. It's in our interest to consider that which we used to relegate to the domain of noise or the indiscernible. Okay? So he says, well, what is the kind of behavior that will help us break out of those ruts? He proposes that that kind of behavior, that kind of activity, is the activity of artistic perception. He says perception. I would change that to artistic practice. Okay? Artistic action, more than perception. So, some of the questions one might be asking would be typically, right, whether social scientific or humanistic or even scientific practices, there may be like questions like, what is a human? What is life? What is anything? Okay? But we're going to try to define and categorize those categories that we're interested in studying. I propose, and not just me, but anyone who would like to take maybe a more, let's say, processionalist, an activist way of thinking about things. We can turn these questions about pragmatic ways of thinking about things. Turn from these questions of what is, to the practice of enabling life, enabling the humane in a non-anthropocentric way, and ways to make sense. So, and here's some desiderata I would like to propose as we do that kind of exploration. This is from the Invisible Committee's book, To Our Friends, and other works similar to that, like Eric Bolto's essay on the commons. This notion of hapticality, which is a way of thinking about the world, or people is the phrase, peopled with, not with things and subjects and bodies, but with forces, powers, bonds. Okay? Things go to forces, instead of thinking about subjects, thinking about powers, instead of thinking about bodies, thinking about bonds. We will come back, we will recover new notions of what is a thing, what is a subject, or how things work together, how subjects come to be, and how bodies can come to be as well. So, now we come back to, we'll be ending today with some points about practice and practicalities. So people talk about risk management, for example, wicked problems. It's now a well-known phrase. I'll just remind you of some of the characteristics which I really enjoy talking about, especially with engineering students. Wicked problems have no solution, first. Okay? They don't have a solution. Every representation that you might make about a wicked situation omits essential details that have a major impact on your decisions. Solving a wicked problem, or trying to solve a wicked problem, becomes a wicked problem. Okay? Treatments do not generalize. In other words, techniques we create for coping with the situation will not help us cope with another situation. The only way to really try it out is not in the lab or studio or in rehearsal. We have to try it out in life, in vivo, in situ. Okay? You don't know what's going to happen until you try it. This is a big risk. And there's no criteria for knowing that things are getting better, that you can define ahead of time. Okay? And finally, we solvers are part of the problem. Okay? It increases this famous, right? How those of us who have more access to whatever scientific knowledge or language or some sort of institutional power should, in her turn, stammer and quake before we attempt to do anything with our power. Okay? So, the master wicked problem the way that Gary Hirsch, my colleague, put it at Arizona State University, is that the kind of the magical becomes that people coming together, trying to make sense of the situation, decide what is to be done, will come with incommensurate value frameworks. Incommensurate. And with those frameworks, they will reasonably, in good faith, disagree on what is to be done. Okay? They're not evil. Some people will try to game the situation, but even without that, they will disagree on what is to be done. And adding facts will not move the needle on that conversation. And yet, how should we proceed? Okay? It's not a new problem. Okay? And we read how Plato in discussing the polis, how to order the city, Athens, would give to the philosophers the privilege of educating the youth to speak truth, to be able to decide what is the right thing to be done. But there were also remaining dilemmas that were insoluble. My example for that, my typical example, my favorite example for that is Antigone, right? In which you have this irresolvable conflict between loyalty to family, to your dead brother, loyalty to the king, to the polis, to the ruler Creon, and loyalty to the gods. And these were irresolvable. That's why it's a tragedy. It's a triple tragedy, triple resolution. And yet people would gather into an event theater, in theater, to encounter those kinds of condensations of these conflicts that are irresolvable with your problems, right? To reimagine the situation other than it is, and sometimes to enact the reimagined world. Okay? My question is, what can we do today, 2,500 years later? All right, we need different techniques. How to articulate, generate, shape the humane, non-anthropocentric, ethico-aesthetic life and science and values, okay? But in the presence of an open-ended, non-prestatable ecology economy. Non-prestatable means this. Means that when we counter a complex situation, it's going to be more complex and should be acknowledged, more complex than any frame that we can bring to it. We can now know all the possible futures that there will be. There's no set of categories, no framework, no rules, no equations. I'm taking mathematics, okay? No set of equations you can set right now ahead of time. You can do it afterward. So okay, that's how things seem to work. Even that is going to be reductive, probably, right? Some artistic reduction. But you cannot say ahead of time. You cannot write down the possible states. In the physics, it would be possible states for a given system ahead of time. Okay, now I come 1, 2, 3. So we are not the only beings in the world that make sense. All sorts of living matter does this, and you might say that all biological matter does this. It makes sense in making, and I don't have time today, I'm giving a talk later on what we mean by making sense, but it's not the same thing as making meaning. It's more primordial to that. But here's a syndrome of cucumber mind that's making sense of this world and finding the way and then finding growing out. This fascinating work from people doing work in plant studies. Okay? So it helps to think about, to look at how other beings make sense of the world in a collective way. What would we mean by democratic sense-making? I would like to say that those for whom it's important that how things are being discerned are the ones which have a say and a place in the making of the instruments of discernment and observation. For me, that's part of democracy. I didn't say humans, just humans. Okay. Mundi Final Mundi, a colleague, an esteemed colleague of mine, Synthesis Network, back at ASU, has a beautiful way of thinking about these different kinds of measures. And we are trying to construct workshops in different communities to construct with the community. First, what are the matters of concern? Okay, and then what are the instruments of observation, articulation? First instruments of observation and discernment that allow us to construct ways to measure with care and measure with concern for value aspects of the complex situation that are important to the community. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, we have this example. He has this example, kind of improvisatory, embodied way. Just for the moment you need it, you cup your hand in the water. You cup your hand in the water, you scoop it out, and put it down, and that's enough water for what you need to do. Okay, it's let's say a corporally improvisatory way. Another is more matters of craft, so you can externalize some of these practices into matter, into materials, which are again very contingent. And thirdly, we have this engineered, more formalized way, which is also very powerful. Each of these different ways of measuring has their use. Okay. Question will be, to what purpose? Okay. Who is modeling or measuring what or whom and why? Always ask that. Always ask that. Coming back to Isabel Stinger's. Isabel Stinger's. Right. I don't have to read all this, okay? I'm going to share with you later on. But basically, she has beautiful work distinctions between different kinds of facts. Facts are established by scientists, experimental facts, and the apparatus that the scientists put together to force agreement. It's not based on what I want to happen, okay? But there are other kinds of facts, like an activist, or a group of activists in Brazil, or she talks about during the AIDS crisis, the community groups in Europe that were forcing changes in how medical sciences were investigating various drugs for AIDS, okay, etc. And there's the kind of agreement which is a result of this kind of recognition of disparate interests, okay, where the facts that are constructed, she calls them concrete facts, and they do not attest to reasons more general than the processes in which they were determined. Very interesting, okay? And they're all important. They're also juridical facts, they're different kinds of facts. Constructed differently, they all have different powers, and one should not allow one to order the others. The important thing, they're all important. They're all important, okay? Key thing here at the bottom, okay, is that the agreement, in the case of this kind of making things in common, events, okay, with respect to a problematic situation, like a weaker problematic situation, the reason for the agreement can be attributed neither to the situation, nor to the manner in which humans have interpreted it. Okay. This is worth taking a picture or thinking about, which is very careful. Okay. Now, I propose this. As academics, some academics, okay, or as artists, we make things. We would make observations about the world. As a scientist, or as an artist, we make statements. We make an object, we make a piece of video, we make a performance work, okay? We put things into the world. Let's flip the intention. Instead, what if the intention could be to enable inhabitants navigating a situation, with concern informed by history, science, structural coupling, metabolism. So in other words, the democratic, I would say, should at least contain this characteristic where the living beings most affected by policy should have a place and a say in the decision process proportionate to the impact. Okay? So enabling experimental life. Second part, imagining alternatives other than what is the case. Many of you have seen the standard diagram done in Arabic, different columns of what is it? Possibility, plausibility, probable, inside that, preferential, okay? But you can ask them, why should these be cones? And why should these be so neatly stacked, etc., etc.? So we need richer ways to imagine, conceiving imagining alternatives. This is thanks to the kind of Well, can I trim down? So here, the lightning, if you see it, if you photograph it at high rates, there's this leader. Before the actual lightning strike, ionized air, these feelers reach out from the ground up and from the sky down, that feel their way, or feel the way, the possibilities of where the actual current should run. So these are kind of precursors or pre-imaginings of the situation. This is there it is, okay. Those are and then you have the actual stroke there, the actual stroke. So this is a physical manifestation of a very general phenomenon of what we could think of as, well, maybe not the potential, but the virtue, okay, which is real. It's real. These are real phenomena. But their virtue is expected to actual stroke. Okay, this is kind of a stand-in for this idea. Now we come into something which is, concretized in a social setting. Role-playing. That is, I worked for a few years with the United Nations Development Program with people who are named here. Judo Bajoto was the one who first reached out, and Yuri Begovic too, on the credited team. And we worked in 7 cities. Their proposal, just as COVID was starting out, was to work with local governments and NGO people and United Nations staff to help people think more systemically, and in the presence of radical uncertainty. All these 5-year plans, etc., were not going to, do not prepare NGOs or governments to actually deal with radical uncertainty. This is the time when COVID was starting out, and just before Ukraine. Okay, so we did this in 7 cities. The idea was we bring people together. They bring all their professional knowledge, but they take roles that are real roles, like in charge of health services, in charge of the city of Yerevan and the media, in charge of whatever, security, transportation, and then they act out the task of running the city. Okay, in the face of surprises of design by the local offices. Okay, we did a version of this, which is that was during COVID, so we did it remotely. And we did a version recently in Phoenix, in person. And there the scenario was running the city of Phoenix under the condition of heat crisis. Okay, I won't have time to talk about that here, but we can look at it later. Third step, articulation. Those are role playing. So kind of trying things out in a more theatrical situation. Next step, the next ambition would be to articulate. How can people articulate? So here are just a couple of possibilities. I really hope that here some of you will come back and we can talk about some of these different ways of maybe articulating reimagined worlds. One is, let's say, you can think of it as experiential experiments, but in the wild, prototyping social forms. A social form could be, that is, we have a venue, okay, where different interests can bring in a social form. A place could be a home, a location like location of learning, not in specific location, or an infrastructure like a financial system, right? Make variations, but it has to be all density and complexity of a real place, okay? A real home, a cafe, whatever it's going to be, or a restaurant. But variations can happen with that kind of integrity. We bring in people from other areas which are more specialized to actually work inside that big situation. Okay, I'm not going to take time to explain that. Eric Bodolo, I mentioned earlier, has done a project in the European Union, funded by the EU, now for 4 years, with street artists and circus performers in a project called The Sphere. And it's worth looking at how they're doing it. The question is how can, thank you, the question is how can street artists and performers have very particular practices, which are theirs alone, how can, and they need to be protective of that, what kind of technical infrastructure can we set up to allow them to have conversations, to share these practices, to make other kinds of derivative works. Okay, in this case, they're using blockchain technologies, not the money part, but blockchain technologies. Okay, and it's worth looking at. This example is what I call navigating determinacy. So here the figure of thought is what's in the background. Okay, this idea is that not about managing the stewardship, that kind of language of a complex situation. This idea, the figure of thought would be, for about 1,000 years, Polynesians, right, were able to cross over the ocean in the face of forces that were far greater, orders of magnitude greater than their own force, their own power, but they had great skill, generations of skillful practices working in ensemble to make their way through this massively more powerful system, the ocean. Okay, even without knowing ahead of time where they were headed. So this is kind of the figure of thought that I like to deploy. when we're talking about navigating indeterminacy of serious play. So to name some of these people that we've been working with, who we've all been talking about participatory steering of complex systems, where all the senses, all the media ways of mediation will be possibly deployed in this kind of combination of both schematized ways of thinking, grasping, and navigating the situation, and ways to intuitively understand what's going on. I think I should probably wrap up soon. Okay? So here's some questions. How do you curate such an event? Who benefits? Who will benefit? Who invests support? How to decolonize this? In the project of imaginations, we were learning as much from our colleagues in Harare and in Beirut, the informal economies, how people manage money, power, electricity, and access to information. We learn more from people in these situations about precarity that we could apply back in the northern countries, in the United States. Okay? And how can we navigate in the think situation, meaning thinking different years of notion of think description, but also now thinking in terms of think in action. Okay? Now solutions, I'll skip that. Okay? And finally, I propose to think about, as a designer or an architect, instead of thinking about building an object and saying this is how you really act or use it, thinking about ways of conditioning possibilities. So here in the theatrical situation, we projected shadows onto the table, and then people, as they come in, well, naturally, will take from the stack of plates and place plates where the shadows of the plates are. So the shadows prefigure what might be doing, might be happening. Okay. Here, in a much more complex situation, here we made a real-time simulation, real-time model of the weather using CM1, which is the standard model for weather models. But we made it real-time and put on the floor so you can become weather. So as you walk, as you gather with other bodies around you, you can become wind, or become masses of moisture, or become masses of heat, depending on how we interpret the motions of the bodies. Okay? And then in that rich situation with the physics itself, it becomes palpable, corporally palpable to groups of people. We can improvise experiments, things to do that they can improvise things that we never considered. Okay, so this is an example of what we can do with rich environments. And finally, I have to point out a project we did thanks to Barbara and the Laboratoire de Geste, and the Musée d'Art here, where we conditioned the space that's in the museum, the old part of the museum, which is of course 800 years old, by setting up cameras so that any motion in the space was taken out and put into different kinds of rhythms and pasts, which would then pass us back together onto the wall. So that was making the stone itself kind of sensitive to registrations of different kinds of rhythms and pasts. Okay, so that people walking into that space were absorbed into this practice of thinking their own movement, making their own movement now part of the colorations of the stone. Okay, I'm not describing it very well, but you can look at it later on. Finally, I have to say this, it's been done for centuries. Okay, this is the Campo in Siena. And I remember walking through Siena through dark stone, very compressed stone, and suddenly you have this decompression. We walk into the plaza, and it's not a flat ground, it's a clamshell, and it slopes down to the focal point of the main municipal building here. Okay? So the architects who designed this, everything was not telling us what to do, what to say to each other in the plaza, but it's absolutely very sharply conditions how gravity works, where people will tend to flow. Okay? So this for me is a beautiful example of not determining, but conditioning events. And let me just stop here, okay? That maybe there are ways to still be very precise, okay? But in a way to not determine what's going to happen, because we can't determine what's going to happen. Okay? In trying to, it can cause multiple problems. But still, we can maybe condition artfully, right? And in a humane way, how things might happen. Thank you.
Xin Wei, you propose many different ways to understand or start the conversation. And maybe I have one question, precisely because it was thinking, going to what you just said at the end, the conditions, and I'm thinking, well, from a philosophical point of view, it's very Kantian, and it's the condition of possibilities, how can you actually make something possible? And so I would like maybe to ask you a little bit more about what you mean by enabling, because before in your paper, in your presentation, you were talking about making sense as a way to enable. And maybe if you can tell us a little bit more how action and knowledge go together and how these conditions are maybe better. I don't know if it's the right way to say it, done by artists. Sense in action.
Yes, yeah, no, both very, very rich questions. When I say enabling, I'm thinking of. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, when I say enabling, I'm thinking of work, for example, by Alicia Guerrero, who recently wrote a very nice book called Context Changes Everything. But she also wrote another book on dynamics of action. She's a philosopher who's been thinking about complexity. And people like Stuart Kaufman from biology, who think about how, instead of the old notion, the classical notion, you might say, there's a niche, and then the creatures evolve to occupy the niche more effectively. Darwinian selection, okay? Thinking about how, is there a microphone on somewhere? No, but thinking about how organisms or novel forms of life, as they emerge, right, constitute new niches, novel niches for other organisms that enable other organisms to come into being. So this is what they call an enabling constraint. So it's not that it determines what's going to happen, but it enables something else to happen. And in fact, its very existence enables novelty. Okay, so I'm making a very short, a long argument by Stuart Kaufman and some of these other people. So we borrow this notion, some of us borrow this notion of enabling constraint. And sometimes constraint can be disabling too, of course, right? So in that sense, maybe we can have a conversation about how this is maybe different or the same. Maybe it's different than some other kinds of notions of conditioning, which are more maybe even domain of logic, let's say, is a little conditioning for mathematics and logic. So that's the beginning of the response.
So maybe if we have questions in the room.
Well, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was really interested in what you said about biology making sense, not meaning. In my own work, I talk a lot about how philosophies around naturalism and binary ontology shape harmful political structures. And I think that may be similar. I saw a lot of connections between your own work and a lot of my studies of Deleuze and kind of thinking of rhizomatic thinking. And I guess my question to summarize is perhaps, could the idea of biology making sense, not meaning, perhaps allow us to have more of a sense of possibility rather than rigid, this is what will happen next? And could you maybe elaborate on what the connection between biology making sense, not meaning is to your overall presentation? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. It gives me an opportunity to Montreal, who wrote a book called Merleau-Ponty and Developmental Ontology. And when I name people, I don't mean to subscribe to any particular school, okay? This interdisciplinary meaning anyway. So there are elements that are very valuable from these people's work. One of them is this. In David Morris's work, he's trying to understand how sense is made in the course of the development of matter, okay, developmental ontology. There's more than just physics, okay. But he says that biological matter, living tissue, okay, is the quintessential example of matter making sense. And it takes a whole book to work out what he's talking about in terms of sense. I'm going to now shift from that, that's how I recommend they look at that, for biology and sense, to Deleuze. In Deleuze, right now, I'm learning and finally learning to read logic of sense. So I'm thinking about Deleuze's notions of sense, which is different, okay? But different in a useful way. where sense from the Stoics is a way of adding what they call sayable, an incorporeal sayable to a situation that makes it different, appear different, or have a different significance. I know the way I'm putting it now sounds human-based, okay? And how does it relate to plants? So, interesting question right now is clearly looking at the plants activity, plants are making sense, but it's not done in language, not done in propositional form, okay? That all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It doesn't work like that, okay? So propositional logic does not happen in matter or in living tissues, and yet they're making sense. So that's why I think that studying vegetable life is very interesting, because it gives parallax from our notion, and that's why I don't want to use words like meaning or semantics even for that matter, but look at something like vegetable life, to think how they'll make sense of the world, and then come back with a more richer notion of like Deleuzean notion of sense, which is this kind of notion of encounter between bodies, fire and iron, for example, or tendril between a plant and a stick. Okay, so that's where it's at right now. It's a very material exploration right now. What sense could mean in living things.
Hello, thanks for your evocative presentation. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit more about the notion of social form, because in my research and my presentation tomorrow, I look at cultural forms in a way that's not too different from social form, in the sense of thinking about the sensuous form of structure, so a kind of a shared sort of affective condition, as a way of thinking about experiences, thinking about democracy. And so I just wonder whether you can just kind of maybe elaborate what you mean by social forms, and whether it has any relation to what you mean by senses.
Thank you. That allows me to replace form by structure. So no, thank you. I didn't want to go into that because it would take a bit to unwrap. Because I want to avoid like a morphological interpretation, and all we need to do is study forms, which then becomes desiccated, okay, from all the material conditions. Is this? Sorry, am I too far, too close? Okay. Too close. All would be basically. I don't want to get into a merely formal analysis, which would then lose historical contingency, material contingency, etc., etc. But structure is interesting. Because when we interpret that in a simultaneous way, Gilbert Simondon wrote, I don't remember the French title, but in English, books have been translated in English on individuation and ontogenesis, which are very, very profound, I think, and interesting for this discussion. And where one can think about different kinds of operations, or what he calls adiabatic operators, that allow us to shape, allow the shaping of multiplicities, magmas, distributions of affect, distributions of matter, yes, distributions of institutions, norms, etc. Okay, it's Deleuzean. But then that reshapes or restructures the magma or multiplicity, which is jargon, okay, of the world, okay, which in turn enables other operations to happen. So this is structure, structure, back and forth. So really thinking in those terms, where everything is very much contingent, but at the moment it can seem very concrete. It can seem like an institution, seem like a form, with all the dynamics and processes of reshaping. I'm trying to avoid using this language, okay, concretization, reshaping, etc. Of the distributions of our kind of multiplicity as we go. Form is just a crutch. But when we speak to very practical things, say a classroom, a school, but it's very interesting to move into an infrastructure. So that way it's less bounded, like the financial system, money. So what is money as a structural operator? How does money act in enabling different kinds of social masses to condense? So I want to recommend work by Nicholas Damiris, who's writing on virtuality and money, hopefully coming out this year, but it's a 20-year project. Very interesting work. Okay, not form, structure. Structuration.
Yes. I'm from the United States. My name is Irene. My question is very concrete. Goes back to what we started to talk about with respect to rage for order versus chaos. So, living in the United States right now, we are faced very strongly with this conflict. And I wondered how you think individual cognitive dissonance plays into what you're talking about with respect to the challenges that we face with uncertainty and how we negotiate.
Is this being recorded? I go back and forth between Canada and the United States. So maybe that's one way to either increase but also allow some parallax in the situation. It helps to go back and forth. No, you guys. I think the answer, that would be difficult to respond to from the point of view of an individual like me. I think it would be really impossible for me, Xin Wei, to respond to that question, right? Because, for example, it would be perhaps more effective for me to think in relational terms. You know, like when I'm talking with students who are asking me, hey, how can I get to Montreal? How can I get to Canadian citizenship? Whatever, you know? It's relational. You say, well, are you a Chinese student from China or a student born in Milwaukee? I mean, you know, and also in what context we're talking about teaching in art, we're talking about engineering, what are we talking? So then we begin to develop, that's an example, that's not enough. I like to think about notions like intelligence, ethical, rightness, not in terms of the property of an individual being or entity, but in terms of the distributed field of relations. In other words, am I treating you as if you're intelligent? Or do you feel treated as intelligent by me? The property of intelligence is a property of relation, not a property of you or me. So I'm thinking maybe that's the beginning of what you deal with dissonance also. Okay, so we can talk about it more later on.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation and the explanation, this rich explanation. I'm from Egypt, my name is Marina. And actually related to the issue of the AI and generated AI, especially what we are facing now toward the young generations, especially young people and children, that those hypermedia narratives are making them conscious and the knowledge, and they are taking everything from social media, starting by blogs, starting by applications, starting by websites. So how we can differentiate and how we can create the awareness, especially among them and among us too, how we can differentiate between the reality, the real, and virtuality, and how, I don't know what to say, if we can say protecting our brain, because there is something now called the brain rot, and that's a physical thing actually, and how we can enhance the human creativity, again another time, and facing the whole revolution of this artificial learning and these kinds of AI, because it won't be this generated AI, it won't be the last one. There are another kind of AI too in front of us. Clear, the two examples that you have shown now. So what is in front of us, it was a little bit of hallucination of AI, because just you put a scene and then you make like an enhanced version of the AI for the scene itself. So we started to make like a hallucination and give you a false information. And what we are facing now, that's AI and social media and hypermedia started to blur our identities. So how we can deal with this?
my university to deal with cheating thanks to, generative AI. And then I teach in an art college, in the art college part of the university. So the people from the law were very, so we should make these surveillance, we should put cameras on, people should make a camera showing their room, blah, 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 whatever. I said, okay. And then the professor from music said, he teaches trumpet, he said, well, I don't have a problem, because I just have them stand up and play the trumpet for me. And it's clear they can do it or not. Okay. So I said, wow, well, maybe we can do something like this also in other domains too. It's the performance of the knowledge. Can you actually use the knowledge that you learned in this class in a given situation which is more thick? Maybe it won't be in the classroom. Maybe it has to be done in a different setting. Okay. So it's the performance of what we know. It also includes things that we may not be able to express in words. It's called tacit, right? Tacit. We know more than we can say. All right. So there's all sorts of knowing that, yes, knowing how, knowing why, knowing when. So it's interviews work. So it could be interesting to think about how, as educators, we can fold that into our practice of teaching and learning.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Zana Ozo from Latvia, from the University of Riga. I don't know, the same question would be probably simple. I tried to connect the beginning of your presentation with your conclusions, and probably you have already answered my question. But basically, at the start, you were asking what are the effects of images, what are the effects of imagining. And this is like kind of my question. It leads to the question, what is the image in this regard? It is definitely not a picture anymore. Yes, it does not represent. And well, basically, if I understand correctly that in our new democracy, new culture, new reality, is the image something that conditions events? Are we ruled by the image? And how we distinguish the image as a picture that refers to some kind of reality and something that we are just imagining, and where we
It's a great way to end the session, I think, with a question like that. Working with people coming from signal processing who are doing, let's say, new techniques for operating on data coming from cameras, the internal representation is not a rectangle, not a flat rectangle. It's just very complex data structures that algorithms act on. So in computational imaging or computer vision, most of these techniques are not, there's no machine and no human looking at flat rectangles in the data structure, okay? And I said this to my friends, my wife, who have generations of practice now, making flat rectangles, okay, whether it's in the glasses or on the wall or on the screen here. We'll call them screens now, okay? You kind of flat, the notion of the image is a planar array of colored dots or colors, okay? Planar array is a flat array. That's the historical consistency. That's what we call image, okay? But if we look at the world right now, I mean, we're using our eyes all the time, okay? They're not flat rectangles, okay? So that's quite interesting. So maybe we can rethink, what does it mean? How is light, how are we mediating what we're doing in the world with our eyes and with light? To rethink how we are using the visual sense, and also let's take other kinds of senses in negotiating the situation, okay? So the flat rectangle is a very particular technical accident, okay? So maybe it would be interesting for this conference to think about that. Imaging.
Yeah.
You ready? Can we do one more?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Hi. Great talk. I'm also American. I don't know if we're just telling people that. Sorry. So when I'm the anticipatory consciousness, I can't help but think about block, right? First block? No idea? Okay. So, especially when we're living at a time that is unfortunately sort of looking more and more like the interwar period, when you're talking about trying to negotiate with people and ethics at a time where we might not even agree or think the other position is ethical in building this new society, have you considered like block and utopian consciousness, not yet, in your research? Thank you.
I don't know that word, but the reason I mentioned invisible community, first book I wrote was The Coming Insurrection, I think, and the next book was the one I mentioned to our friends. One thing they talk about is this idea of revolution or the utopia is always deferred, right? You can think of it as an aspiration if you want, but what's really urgent is kind of the quotidian, the in-between, right? The in-between texture of what we're doing moment to moment, but we also make technologies and non-humans too, okay? So when I mention these kinds of techniques here, I'm really thinking in terms of word operators to use simultaneous language. They're really thinking of these different kinds of instruments or techniques of what I call lenses and tactics. Lenses would be concepts to keep in mind as we're facing a situation bigger than our power to influence completely or control, or tactics would be things to try doing in such a wicked complex situation. Okay, so that's, and then of course through design with some intentions in mind. Okay, which we talk some desiderata in mind. So I don't know the work that you're referring to. It may or may not be amenable to this kind of informed way of developing practices, techniques, and lenses and tactics, but we can talk about that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Xin. So now we are on to the different parallel sessions, and so let me see. We have 20 minutes break, more or less. So there's coffee.
Yes, we did. We did. Yes, we did.
I would like to.
Pleasure.